Making a piped edge is not as difficult as it looks. One of the hallmarks of a piped edge is an even thickness all along the seam and no visible stitching between the ground fabric and the piping. That's what this lesson will be covering. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. Part of the success of this project is using what I call the proper fill. Now these three here, these are examples of the fills that I like to use. These two here, the white is rat tail, the gold is mouse tail. Rat tail is 3 millimeters wide, mouse tail is 2 millimeters. They're pretty much the same kind of cord. What I like about these is that the cord is rigid. It doesn't smash down, it's not terribly spongy. And so you can really get a nice smooth surface. This also has a smooth surface. Now on the smooth surface, if you're using something like a charmeuse, any other kind of fill is going to it's going to read through the fabric. The texture will read through. This has a nice smooth surface, so you are assured of an even thickness all along, and you are assured of a flat surface all along. And this here, this is what's called shoelace. Shoelace comes in a variety of diameters. It's a bias cover over a core. Again, it's not too spongy, so it makes a very firm result in the final product. You don't need a lot of fancy tools for this, but what I like is this is a generic adjustable zipper foot. This is the 1/4 inch wide. I think it's the best. Now, the reason I like this is that you turn the screw and you can adjust the foot to one side or the other of the needle, and you can adjust the foot so that the needle is either close in or right at the edge. You'll see this a little more as we go along. But this particular foot, this is on an adapter for Bernina. It's a generic foot. You can get it for most machines. So, generic adjustable zipper foot. Something you want to have. For the piping, I'm going to be using rat tail. And so we're assuming a 5/8 of an inch seam. So the strips will be 1.25 to 1.5 inches. I'm just going to say 1 3/8 just to split the difference. There we have our bias strips. Once you've cut your bias strips, you want to press them to relax the bias. And from here, we'll go to the machine to fill the piping. Before filling the piping, we want to adjust the foot so that the needle is as close into the little notch as possible, the zipper foot in position number 1. I tend to like using the left side of the foot to fill piping. Some people like to use the right side, but either way, the needle is as close to the inside of that curve as you can get. Now your stitch length for filling the piping is going to be 4 to 5. You don't need a short stitch here, you just need to hold it together. Next, we lay the fill, the rat tail, on the wrong side of the fabric, and we fold. We come in here, and sometimes if you want to put a pin in there, you can. Then we lower the foot. Now, the beauty of the rat tail is that it's a rigid cord, so you can really put the edge of the foot right up next to the cord. You don't have to worry about the foot running over the cord. So you're going to get an even thickness all along the cord. So now when we sew, since the foot is in position number 1, not a final seam, when you look at the finished piping, you're going to have a little bit of slack. That's what you want, because the final seam is going to come in where my thumbnail is and be a little closer to the cord, so that all of the stitching you've used before the final seam goes into the seam allowance. Almost done. Okay, there we are. That is what we have. Our next step is to attach this to the body. So here we have our sample, and these are the right sides facing up, so I'm going to put it on the front side, and I'm assuming a 5/8 inch seam. Now this is one of those fun little things that people don't really realize, but the seam gauge here, that distance is 5/8. So what you can do, let me just zoom in because you really want to see this. You want see, if you notice, you can see down here that the edge of the seam gauge is a little bit past the stitching. That's what you want, because the final seam is actually going to land at the edge of the seam gauge. So when you're basting your piping down, if you're assuming a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you can use that little edge to baste. And I tend to baste with a double thread. And especially on a curve, if you really want to tightly control where that piping falls, the best way really is to baste. These basting stitches will come out later, obviously, but for the time being, they're in. Now, what you can do in here to make this go around the curve a little more readily, you can make some clips about halfway in, and then see how nicely that opens up. So again, you check it as you're going around. Yep, still good. Because you're going to baste it first. You want to baste it down. Then our next step will be at the machine, which you'll see in just a moment. So I'm going to go off camera and finish this, and I'll bring it back in just a moment. Okay. All done. From here, we go over to the machine. Now at the machine, the foot is still in position number 1. I've changed threads so you can see how this works. We're still going to use a fairly long stitch for between 4 and 5 because we just want to tack this down. So again, when you're steering, you can put a little bit of pressure towards the right so that the foot will ride up against the fill in the piping. So this is position number 1. This is not the final seam. We're just nailing this down. So you can see here that the orange stitching and the green stitching are pretty much on top of each other because they're both foot in position number 1. Now from the reverse, you can see the green stitching. That is the stitching we just sewed. This is going to become important in the next step. So back to the work table. So now we have both sides of this sample. So we're going to put right sides together and pin. But notice I'm pinning them together right side up so that the green stitching is visible. That is very important in the next step, because if you can see the green stitching, you don't have to really do much except steer, because you know where your stitches are going to fall. Now you could hand baste this together, you could pin it. If it's fairly complex, you would want to baste it, but for something that's fairly straightforward like this, I'm going to pin. Now I'm going to talk about pinning for just a moment. Notice I pin parallel to the seam, not perpendicular. Debates rage, but I prefer this. I find it's a little easier to manage. From here, we go back to the sewing machine. Before we begin, you can see that I have adjusted the foot so that the needle is right at the edge of the foot. This is important for what we're going to be sewing. I've also changed the thread so you can see the net effect of what we're doing. By having the needle a little closer to the edge, it's going to be closer to the fill, and the green stitching is going to fall in the seam allowance. So we've shortened the stitch to a standard 2.5, and so now when we're sewing, you want to give it a little bit of a pull towards the right as you sew, and the foot will stop up against the rat tail, and the blue stitching will be slightly to the left of the green stitching, which is what we want. So let me show you the result. There we are. See that? That is what we want. The green stitching is position number 1. The blue stitching is position number 2. So what happens? Usually when you're making piping, you end up seeing the stitching that you used to sew the piping closed. With this, since you've sewn the piping with the stitch a little further out, the final stitch will make it so that when you turn it right side out, you can pull it one way or the other, and you have a nice, snug, even thickness all along this seam, and you don't see any of the stitching. But we're not done yet. What I'm doing here is staggering the notches, which you can see here, the little V shape, that's a notch. Same thing happens with clips. If you cut both seam allowances at the same place, you're going to get weird little angles when you turn it and press it. And so, by staggering them so that they fall alternating, what that will do is that will ensure that your seam will press smoothly. So staggering your clips. And now let's turn this right side out. So it's starting to look like something. But it's not done yet. Off to the pressing table. We begin by just pressing the seam allowance. You don't want to press all the way on top because you could leave an impression of the rat tail on the outside. And here, from here, we're going to turn this right side out. And what I like to do, instead of just putting the iron down, is I like to hit it with a little steam, and then just finger press it. And then if you want to really flatten it out, then you can use your clapper. But ideally, you should not put the iron on this. I don't think it looks well because you run the risk of pressing shine into your seam allowances. And so here, is that not a thing of beauty? Piping. That's how you do it. I'm often asked, how do you sew piping to a corner? So this little lesson is just that, how to navigate corners with piping. We've got a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. Here we have the materials for our corner. I've cut some wool, so I have a front and a back. I've also prepared piping, and we have some marking tools. So this is what we're going to be using to start. You baste all of this down as you would for the curved piping. But one thing I want to do here is I want to know where to turn that corner. So I'm going to put this dot right there. And then I'm going to stitch in place a couple of times. To hold this. Like so. From here, cut to that dot, and then see how I roll this up? You want to roll that up because if you try to make it flat, the cord is going to be too short and it will round the it'll make a round corner. So I'm having this sit up and I'm pushing it back slightly. Because this extra slack right in here, you want that when we turn the corner. Now you notice I based with a double thread. It's just a preference. There's no hard and fast, you have to do one, you have to do the other. So that's just something to know, just a little bit of an aside. Now, so let me baste. So I'm going to baste down to the main corner. And same thing over here. We want to know where that corner is. And so again, stitch 2 or 3 stitches there, and we're going to cut right there. And then again, tip this up. And so you notice, see, I'm creating a little bit extra here. That is what you want to do. Because if you go too short, you're going to round that corner. And then you stitch again a couple times in place. And I'm going to go off camera and hand base this and bring you back the results. Okay, so here we are. We have the corners basted. Now we go to the machine. Here you can see that I have the needle. I'm going to bring this out just a tiny bit. So the needle is inside, well inside the edge of the foot. So we are going to sew the piping down with the foot in position number 1. This is not a final seam. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to start at the top. And the stitch length is 3.0. You don't have to have a short stitch on this. So coming down to this corner, I'm going to stitch off and start over and stitch to make it a little bit more square. So you can see. And then I'm going to turn and come back here and continue. And as we come down here, same thing. You're really going to have to kind of navigate this, but so there's that. So I've stitched there, and then I'm going to turn this back this way. So I'll show you the results here. So you can see we've sewn to there, and I have sewn 90° there. It's going to look like that. Now, back to the work table. So here we are. We put these two right sides together, and then we want to pin. So I'm going to pin these two raw edges first. because we're going to stitch this corner in 2 different passes. So I'm going to pin that there, and I'm not going to go crazy pinning here, but I am going to pin here because my first pass is going to be, I'm going to sew from here off to here. So what I want to do here is I want to sew some very short hand basting stitches. Now when you get up here, the object here is you want to push that piping as far in as you can get. That way when you sew these little short stitches, you're not going to risk catching the rat tail. There we are. Okay. So here, lots of basting thread, but there you have it. So I'm going to go to the machine now and sew from here all the way off here. So, off to the machine. So here I am at the machine, and you can see that the needle is just right at the edge. Let me stop that here. Needle is right at the edge of the foot. So now we're going to go back to a standard 2.5 stitch, and our first pass is going to be there we are. So this is position number 2, final seam. And so what I like to do about here, about say 3/4 of an inch from the corner, is to shorten the stitch length to 0.75 to 1.0. Let me just show you what that looks like. And see if we open this up from this side, we will have pushed this one way. So now we're going to go back to the work table to sew the rest. So here we are, and the next stop here is we want to push this way back. We want the piping itself to be all the way in, and you can tell that by feel. So I'm going to pin it right here. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off camera, and I'm going to get some more thread basting and thread baste to about here. Then I will bring it back to show you the kernel of information here that you need. Now, at this corner here, we're going to baste with some short stitches to make sure everything stays where it needs to stay, which is facing in. And then I will continue on. And there's really no way to get away without doing this with basting. I just want to tell you that. Don't try to save time by just trying to wing it with pins, because it won't work. Okay, so here we are. And so I have massaged everything back away from these stitches. So now I can sew with some very short hand basting on the blue stitching line, because that will fall into the seam allowance when we're finished. So I have hand basted from here to here. So now we're going to go back to the machine, and we're going to start here and stitch off to there and start there and stitch back this way. So that is how we're going to sew this on the machine with the zipper foot. So back to the machine. So here we are, zipper foot in position number 2. Again, stitch length is 0.75 to 1 because we want these stitches to be quite short. And so, just lower this down a teeny bit. So you're going to sew ever so slightly to the left of the blue stitching. Position number 2, final seam. About 3/4 of an inch, then you lengthen your standard 2.5. So off here, I'm going to show you. So there, and that sews off here, and we're going to come back here and sew down the other way to make that corner. Okay, so let's turn this around and pull out a little bit so you can see. So yeah, you see the green stitching is the stitching we just sewed, position number 2. So next we will go to the pressing table. Actually, I decided to clip the corners. I just think it's fair that you get to see this. So here on the main corner, you're just going to cut it like that, about 1 millimeter between the stitching, and then here on this one, so yeah, so here we are, ready to turn right side out. So I will flip this right side out. So here I have everything turned right side out, ready for pressing. So the initial press is there and here. Now, to get a square corner, as square as you can get, what you're going to do is you're going to take a needle threaded with a double thread of Mara 30, and you're going to catch that, and you're going to pull it as you steam. So normally I would put a pressing cloth on this, but not for this. This is a sample. And if I want to get this corner squared, same thing. You just give that a little bit of a tug. So here you have it. It looks pretty darn good. Now one more little trick here. Pinch it like that. So that is the way that I get a square corner. And here we have it. Piping on a corner. One question I get asked is, how do you join piping? If you're piping all the way around something, how do you join the two ends? And there is the answer. That's how it looks on one side, and that's how it looks on the other side. So this little video is going to answer the question about how to achieve this kind of perfection. You have a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. As you can see here, I have basted the piping. We're assuming this is going all the way around, and we need to join it wherever we join. So I've basted the piping on both sides. I've left about 3 inches. You want to have a little bit of room to maneuver here. So what you want to do then, and give yourself a little extra piping. See, what we're going to be doing is we're going to cut the piping down a little bit. We're going to open up the cover, and we're going to sew the cover closed and then lay the piping in after. That's where we're going with this. So let us say that we want the join to be right about there. So if you cut, say, about 1.5 inches or 2 inches, you can always trim it out later. 1.5 inches here, 1.5 inches here. These can go away. See, ultimately we're going to bring the strips together here. So our next step will be opening up this piping. It's just much easier to clip the stitches and pull the stitching out. I'm not going to burn through a lot of time making you watch me do this, but we're going to take the seam out back to here on both of these. So I will go off camera and do just that and bring you back the result. So as you can see, I have taken the stitches out. So the next step here really is, let's get these out of the way. And really you can pin these down if you really want to, just to get them out of the way. So the next step here is we want to put these strips right sides together. And this is one of those times when you can join the bias strips not sewn on the straight of grain. You know, usually you sew it on a straight of grain. And so what I found here is what's a little easier to kind of get your bearings is you can create a crease there, and then you can bring this over to there. So then you know where you can put your seam. And then, so I'm going to pin this together. Then what you want to do is you just want to see if this is going to lie flat or if you need to make it a little shorter. So it lies flat. Now the next step, I will take this over to the machine and sew, and I'll sew with a shorter stitch, like 1.0, 1.5. You want a short stitch because you're sewing the piping. I will bring this back after I've sewn it. I decided instead to meet you at the pressing table because we have to press this open anyway. This is where the point presser comes in really handy. So what we want to do here is just press this seam open like so, and then trim these seam allowances to 1/4 inch. You don't want a large seam allowance in there. So this is where we're at, and next I will go back to the work table to pin this together and deal with the fill. So here we are. Now you can see that we've sewn this so that this is the proper length. If you have to restitch it, if it's a little bit too long, I would recommend you go back and restitch, because you want all of this to lay flat. And now the next step is going to be, and this is important, So you want to lay the two ends of the fill parallel, right next to each other. And I like to make the cut right on the seam because you're going to, the object here is you want both of these fills to sit end to end. And so having them sit end to end over the seam is going to camouflage that slightly. So we're going to just come in here and just make a cut. This is where you want good scissors. See how those two sit end to end? That is what you want. Now, we're going to bring this down and over. Pull out a little bit. And then I'm going to pin all of this down and go get some needle and thread and baste them. So I will go off camera and baste all of these seam allowances together and bring you back the result. But that's how it should look at this stage. So I'm back. Everything is basted in place. Our next stop is the sewing machine. So here we are at the sewing machine, and as you can see, I have the zipper foot on, and the foot is in position number 1. So you can see that the needle is somewhere on the inside of this curve, and I've set this for a 3.5 length stitch. And let me just pull this out just a tiny bit. So now, it's a simple matter coming in here, and sewing. Now, a little note. I didn't sew the piping down before I did all of this stuff. But what you could do is you could sew the piping down to one end and then start on the other end. You can machine it down in stages. Now let me show you the result here. So there we have it. And like I said, you could have sewn the initial sewing to here, stopped it, done all of this, or you could do it all in one pass. But now we are ready to go back to the table, and I will pin everything right sides together and sew this to finish. Back from the machine. And so now, this is pretty straightforward. This will look very familiar. So I will take this over to the machine, sew everything with the foot in position number 2, press it, and I'll bring you back the result. And here we have the finished product. Now, as you can see, the thickness doesn't drop off because the two ends of the fill are sitting edge to edge, and they're sitting right behind the seam, which makes it so that they don't pad out. And you can see also it doesn't make a hinge. Here is the reverse. So there you have it. If you need to join the ends of your piping, this is the cleanest way. Piping on a V is a challenge, and the challenge is to get a crisp corner that doesn't pucker and is clean. That's the lesson that we're going to be covering. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. To prepare the V shape, you can see here I'm using a strip of fusible tricot. This is about 1.25 inches wide for a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And the lengthwise grain runs this way and this way. That keeps the V itself from stretching. So on the face side, this is how you will prepare the V. Now on the back, you really just need to put some fusible in this area here so that this portion, when we finish the end of the V, will be stabilized. So now we have both of these pieces stabilized. The next step is going to be basting the piping. We started on one side of the V-neck, the assumption being that this is going to be a continuous strip. If you have an opening at the center back of the V-neck, of course, you would break this into two separate pieces. But as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm thread basting the piping down to the seam allowances of the V, but I'm not going all the way down to the end. So I'm going to be stopping, there we go, be stopping a couple inches before the end, because we want to secure the bulk of the piping first, and then we will navigate the ends. So there we have the two. So we're about, I'd say about an inch from this intersection here. The next step will be going to the machine and sewing with the foot in position number 1. I will do that off camera and I will bring you back the results. Here we have the work back from the machine, and what you can see here is that the green stitching stops pretty much where the hand thread basting stops, as this is not a final seam, because the next step we need to do is figure out where these two pipings are going to intersect. Looking at these two pipings, this is the intersection point, and so what I want to do here is just to figure out with the pin. You can see I've hit the stitching line on both legs. So what I will do is come here, mark a dot, and then again transfer that to here. And we mark another dot. So my first step is going to be pinning this one here. So I will pin that, and I will hand baste from here to here, and I will bring that back. Okay, so I've hand basted in pale blue. So let me just show you the result here. Because the next step, we're going to go to the machine, and we're going to machine from here down to there. I will meet you at the machine. We're going to begin the stitching right here where we left off of the machine basting that based the piping down. We will be sewing initially with the foot in position number 1, and we will be stitching with a fairly long stitch, like a 4.5, until about an inch before the mark down, and you'll see that in a moment. So we're going to start okay, so now there's our dot. At this point, we're going to shorten the stitch length to 0.75. And I'm just going to put this there so I know where to stop. And you want to stop right on that mark. So let me just see. Yes, we've stopped right on that mark. So now I can raise the presser foot, take this out of the machine. I'll show you the results. So what you can see we stopped right on that mark. And you can see there were very short stitches. The short stitches are from here to here. This is going to be important in the next step. From here, we'll go back to the work table. Here we are, back at the work table. And so my next step is going to be trimming the seam allowance. I'll trim that seam allowance fairly narrow. So as you can see there, it's about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to trim it a little narrower here. You just need enough to hold, because the next row of stitching, we don't want to catch any of this seam allowance when we put this other side down. So, short stitches from here to here, we trim this seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. And from here, I'm going to put this pin. We want to pin the two marks together so that we know right where that should fall. So I'm going to turn it this way a little and pin. And so the next step, I will go off camera and baste this side and bring you back the result. Okay, so we have that basted down. So again, we're going to go back to the machine and sew the other piece down. So I will meet you again back at the machine. So here we are back at the machine, but you can see that I have adjusted the foot. I need to adjust it just a teeny bit more. I've adjusted the foot so that it sits in position number 1, but on the opposite side of the foot. It's going to make this a little easier coming down and sewing. So what we'll do here is we start out at the standard 4.0 basting, because this is where our basting left off, and we're headed down to here. So to begin, put the foot down, and sew to about 1/2 inch or so from this mark. Then we shorten the stitch to 0.75 again, and we can also, let me pull out for just a moment here, we can also pull this out a little bit because we want it out of the way. And then get you a good look here. Short stitches. And trim this thread. I'll show you the results. So as you can see, again, we went a teeny bit past, but what we can do, which I'll do off camera, you can pick these stitches out like so, and I'll back those off to where that ends, because what we're looking for, just to give you a little heads up, we want these two ends of the stitching to end at the same level, because that little opening there is where we're going to pull the ends of the piping through. So I will meet you back at the work table. So I've backed off the stitches so that they're level. What you're looking at here is you want these to end pretty much square. What we'll be doing next, for reference, we'll draw a line there. That's going to tell us where our stitches end when we're sewing the two together. Now, one more little move that we need to do before we sew. If you remember, we narrowed this seam allowance down. We also need to narrow this one down, because you don't want to catch any of these seam allowances when we sew the final V. So I'm just going to trim that out. So in the final V, we're going to hold these back like so. And I'll just put a pin right there, just to keep them from causing problems later. There we are. And next, we sew this right sides together with the other side. Here is the other side, right side of the fabric here. As you can see here, I went back and changed this. I felt I needed a little more staying power here. You can always peel this off later afterwards, but having a little more of the interfacing in here is going to serve you well. So, right side up, and this right side down. What we will do is pin, and what I like to do, sort of like when we applied the pipings to begin with, I like to sew from here down to here, and then from here down to here. So that's why I'm orienting the pins this way, so that when it goes through the machine, the pins will pull off as the fabric feeds under the foot. So there we are. From here, we go back to the machine. You can see here that I've adjusted the needle so it's right at the edge of the foot, zipper foot in position 2, because this is a final seam. I'll use first one side of the foot, then the other. So put the work under the machine. We're going to start with the standard 2.5 stitch. And we will sew down to about 1 inch from the end. Okay, so here, this is where we shorten the stitches now to 0.75, and we will stop on the mark that we made earlier. There we go. See that better? Here we are. We stopped on the mark. Now let me bring this out of the machine. Show you what we've sewn. Oh, it looks like I stopped a little above it, so I'm going to go back and fill that in. I'll bring that back when I'm done. You can see here where I've just stitched down to the mark. So we have one side sewn, and now we'll sew the other side. So you can see here the foot is in position number 2, right at the edge. And now, again, with the 2.5 stitch, we'll start this way and sew towards the point. And about an inch from, again, shorten the stitch to 0.75. And we sew to the mark. Now let me just check. Yep, okay. We're right at the mark. Okay, let us take the work out of the machine and show you the result. And again, I thought I had it. I need to go down a couple of stitches, but first let's look at the back. And actually on the back they look like they read across. I think I'm going to add the 2 stitches here. So I will add the 2 stitches, bring it back, and show you the result. So I'm back, and as you can see, both rows of stitching fall on that line, and they're now level across the back. Our next step is back at the work table. So here we are at the work table, and I'm going to draw on this, what we're clipping. You don't necessarily have to do this, but just for clarity, I'm going to show you, because we're going to clip little triangles. That's on one side, and we want to make the same marks on the other side for reference. So this is why we have all of this interfacing here. So when you're clipping, this is where I'm going to go again on the tailor points. The tailor point has a knife edge, which has a wider surface here. It has a bevel edge, which has a narrower surface. When you're clipping and sliding the blade between the layers, you want the beveled edge against your palm before you're clipping. It just serves you very, very well. So what I'm going to do here is just slide. See how nicely that slides under? So you're going to clip it right to the end of that stitching. And the same here. Now you can sneak up on it. You don't have to take it all in one lunge. Because if you clip too short, if you leave a millimeter there, you're going to get a pucker. So we'll flip this over and make the same clips from this side. And on this side, if you clip through the first stitching, the green stitching, all good, not to worry. Okay, so next we're going to be turning everything inside out. Tool time. This is what's called a hemostat. They come in different configurations. Some of them have curved ends, some of them have straight ends. You can get them at quilting supply places. I'm sure you can get them on Amazon. But it's good to have a variety of these for your sewing needs. So we're going to be using this, but first we want to unpin. And then I'm going to reach through here between the layers. And this is why having a narrow one is very useful. And see, it comes up here. And so you feed one first through gently, gently, gently. And then the other. I'm going to cut some of this off. We don't need all of that. So again, there we are. And you feed the second one through. Again, gently, gently. So when we turn this right side out and give those two ends a tug, that's how we're going to bury the ends in the V. At this point, we need to go to the pressing table. When pressing, you first want to press as sewn. And then I like to press one seam allowance towards one side. You're still being careful with these intersections here. And then this one here. It's going to make things easier. So now we turn, and if I were actually making this as a real garment, I would use a pressing cloth, but since this is a sample, I want you to see what it looks like. So that's one side, and then the other. Notice I'm not pressing into that V just yet. We just want to get all of this set up. And then finally, here, let me just pull in just a teeny bit there. What you're going to do is lift these up, and you want the two pipings to kiss. You want them to lay flat and kiss. And also you want these little triangles to be square. So once the two pipings kiss, you can then come in, give it a press, and there you have it. So next we go over to the sewing machine because we have to do some work here. So here we are at the sewing machine, and one thing I like to do before I sew that little triangle is I like to sew these two together. And obviously you would color match your thread if this was a real piece, but I'm using, oops, ticklish business, but gotta do it. So I'm sewing these together. 2 or 3 stitches ought to do it. You just want to hold it together until you run this under the machine. And I'm going through the rat tail as well. Oops. Okay. So now let's just look at the result here and see how nicely that brings those two together. So the next step, we will peel both of these layers back and sew the final triangle. So as you can see, I have the needle to the left of the foot, and we're going to be sewing at the 0.5 stitch. So now, how this looks, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to fold this back, and you can keep these a little bit close together if you wish. So I fold that back, and I also want to fold back the other layer, because you just want to stitch this end. So it takes a little kind of getting used to. And you could, if you really wanted to, hand sew this before you put it under the machine. And then you just lower, and since your pipings are sewn together, you don't have to worry about them separating. So now let's look at the result here. There we go. Is that not beautiful? And there you have it. So, I'll meet you back at the work table. So here we are, back at the work table. And really, the only finishing is we want to trim this out. We don't need but about 1/4 of an inch there. Make sure that our threads are trimmed. So you can see just enough so that you don't get a weird little dimple there. So there we have it. The V. A beautiful thing to behold. I know this has been a rather long video and a bit of a slog perhaps, but I wanted to give you all of the information on the different situations where you're going to be using piping. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. Thank you for joining us.